Hello, I'm Andrea, and we've been making a series of videos about Bible friends. So today we're going to be talking about David, King David, the great King David. He was very loyal to the anointed of the Lord, who was Saul, and he was best friends for life with Jonathan, Saul's son. But Saul, because of his mental illness, he was very jealous of David, and he tried to kill him. One day he even took a spear and threw it across the room. David was able to get out of the way just in time. So Jonathan warned David that he'd better be somewhere else for a while because Jonathan could not handle his father's violent moods. So Jonathan stayed with his father, and they fought against the Philistines together. But David had to go away just for his own safety, and he kept running away from Saul. He wanted to fight side by side with Saul and Jonathan, but that was not to be because of Saul's mental illness. So David collected around himself a band of soldiers, and they fought against the Philistines themselves. Now, they were the kind of fighters that we would now call guerrilla fighters. That doesn't mean they were fighting against guerrillas. It's a French word that means a different kind of fighting where you just never know quite where your enemy is. And that's the way that they fought. They fought against the Philistines, and sometimes David and his band would pretend to be helping the Philistines. So Ahimelech was a priest in one of the towns, and David went to Ahimelech because he and his band of soldiers were very hungry and thirsty. Ahimelech fed him, and he also gave him the sword of Goliath. Now remember, Goliath was the great giant that David had defeated when he was just a young boy. But Ahimelech didn't know that someone was watching. It was a man named Doeg the Edomite. An Edomite would be someone from Edom, and his name was Doeg. And so Doeg went and told one of the Philistine kings, "We've found David, your enemy David." And so he knew he was in trouble because this particular Philistine king had been looking for David to kill him. But what David did was to pretend to be crazy, and he was foaming at the mouth and doing all kinds of crazy things with his hands. And the king said, "Am I short of crazy people that you have to bring me another one? Let this person go." And so he did let him go. Now David's, one of David's soldiers, they didn't really have generals and like they do in regular army. But one of David's soldiers was named Abishai. And then for Saul, his most loyal general was named Abner. So one time Abner and Saul and their army were sleeping in the field, and Abner and Saul were sleeping close together because Abner's job was to watch after the king. And they had a water jar and a spear close to Saul's head. So Abishai and David sneaked up on them. They didn't want to kill them. What they wanted to do was to prove that David was not their enemy. So they stole the water jar, and they stole the spear, and got to a safe distance, and they called, "Saul, Saul, wake up! How come your General Abner is not protecting you? Look around, see what's missing." And then Saul woke up and said, "David, my son, is that you?" And he missed him so much. He wished that they were still fighting together. And David said, "Am I a flea? I'm not going to hurt you. Just you're fighting against me, and there's nothing to fight about because I know that you are the Lord's anointed." And he said, "By the way, are you missing a spear by any chance?" Well, Saul looked around. He had no spear. That's a pretty important thing. And he said, "And how about your water jar? Are you missing a water jar by any chance?" And of course, Saul was also missing his water jar. So just to make his point, David picked up the water jar and the spear and bang, 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 bang. I've got your spear and I've got your water jar. And Saul realized for a moment that David really wasn't his enemy. And he said, David, you are more righteous than I am, and someday the kingdom will go to you. Well, that is what happened. And eventually, Saul and Jonathan were both killed in battle. And David was very sad that he had never been able to reconcile or reunite with his old friends, Saul and Jonathan. But David took over the kingdom of all 12 tribes, and he was a very wise king. Now he had trouble with his son Absalom, who betrayed him. Absalom got into the heads of some people that thought that David wasn't a good enough king, and Absalom actually started an army which fought against David, and David won. David was so sad when he found out that Absalom had died that he almost came apart. But his own generals said, you need to come out and cheer up the people because this has been a great battle and you have won, and you don't want the people to be discouraged. The thing we mainly remember about David, and the reason we remember, is because of the Psalms, how much David loved the Lord. David didn't even know Jesus in the flesh the way we do. Of course, we know that Jesus has always been from the very beginning until the end of time and long beyond that. So it's always been Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But David had not seen Jesus in the flesh. However, he loved the Lord so much. It was so personal. And that's what we want for all of you. We want you to have a personal, loving relationship with God where you can tell him anything and he will listen to you, and God will always protect you. That's what David had. And all of the Psalms that David wrote, even complaining Psalms, they start out complaining, and by the end of the Psalm, he's just praising and praising God, how wonderful God is to him. So David really, really loved the Lord. In fact, even this one Psalm that Jesus says from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's Psalm 22. And if you read it all the way to the end, by the time you get to the end, he's just praising and praising God. No longer worried that God might have forsaken him. So that's what we mainly remember about David, is how much he loved the Lord. But as an old man, he committed a terrible sin. He had stopped going into battle, had a little too much time on his hands, and he stole the wife of his general Uriah. I don't know if Uriah was a general. I really don't know. He was a Hittite, so he really wasn't Jewish, but he was so loyal to David. He was the kind of person that when he would get home from battle, he'd go straight to his king's apartment and sleep outside the door so that the king would be safe. That's just the kind of person he was. There was no one in his whole army that was more loyal or trustworthy or true than Uriah. And David stole his wife. His wife's name was Bathsheba. And he compounded this sin, made it much worse by having Uriah killed in battle. He stole the wife, killed the husband. And God knew that he had done this. So one of these days, the prophet Nathan came over and he said, O king, which is how I suppose he addressed the king, something has happened in your kingdom and you need to know about it. And David said, what is it? He said, well, there was a man who just had one little sheep. And the sheep was the pet of the family. The children would dance with the sheep. They would sleep with the sheep in their same bed. They just loved this little sheep. It was the only one that they had. And a rich man who lived next door, he needed to feed some guests who had come from out of town. And he said, well, I don't think I'll slaughter one of my own sheep. I think I'll just come over here and get that little sheep that belongs to my neighbor. That's going to be a lot easier for me. So he stole the sheep, butchered the sheep, cut it into pieces, and served it to his guests. And Nathan said to David, "What do you think?" Well, David was outraged. He knew about the justice of the Lord, and he said, "Show me that man, and I will make sure that he is severely punished for the way he has treated this poor man, that he didn't take a sheep out of his own flock, but had to steal the one sheep that belonged to that poor man." And Nathan said, "You are the man." And that is when David realized what he had done by stealing Bathsheba and killing her husband Uriah. And he wrote a very beautiful psalm. He said, "Against you, Lord, against you only have I sinned and have done what is wrong in your sight." Well, he had sinned not just against the Lord. He had sinned against himself because he wanted to be a righteous man. He had sinned against Uriah and Bathsheba. They had a little son, Bathsheba and David. And I believe that every child has a responsibility or something that they're born for. And that little child didn't live very long. He died after a short while. But he brought his father back to prayer to God. And David poured out his heart in prayer, hoping that that child would be saved. The child died. And then another little baby was born, and his name was Solomon. I'm sure you've heard of Solomon. Solomon was the last of the kings of the undivided Israel. And we're going to find out more about Solomon when we have more time together. And I want to thank you for joining me today, learning about King David.